My mother called that morning to tell me I'd never be as successful as Marcus. By nightfall, he said it loud enough for half a conference center to hear. My brother's voice cut through the marble lobby like a blade designed specifically to wound. "She's just admin," Marcus said, and the laughter that followed hit my skin like a slap. I stood there, frozen, holding my conference badge while executives in tailored suits turned to see who he was talking about. The betrayal wasn't new. Marcus had used those exact words to diminish me for years. But this time, he'd weaponized my humiliation in front of people who mattered. I could feel my cheeks burning as his wife, Linda, smiled uncomfortably beside him, clearly embarrassed, but not enough to stop him. That phrase, "just admin," had become his favorite tool to put me in my place. And today he'd sharpened it in front of an audience that included CEOs, investors, and decision-makers who controlled millions. I couldn't believe he'd chosen this moment, this place, to remind everyone, and me, of the role he thought I played in the world. The corporate summit was supposed to be about partnerships, innovation, and growth. But Marcus had turned it into his personal stage for family drama. I'd heard those words so many times growing up that they'd become background noise, a constant reminder that I was never quite enough in my family's eyes. But standing here, in this professional space I'd worked so hard to earn my place in, the humiliation felt different, sharper, more public, more unforgivable. Every person who laughed, every head that turned, every whisper that followed became part of a moment I knew would either break me or redefine everything. What Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I wasn't there as someone's assistant or a low-level employee tagging along. The shocking truth was hidden behind my silence, behind years of letting them underestimate me while I built something they couldn't see. His mockery was based on an outdated version of me, a story he'd been telling for so long that he'd never bothered to check if it was still true. I'd learned long ago that family betrayal cuts deeper than any other kind, because it comes from people who are supposed to lift you up, not tear you down. The venue buzzed with conversations about deals worth millions, about companies being evaluated and futures being decided, and my brother had no idea where he actually was or who was listening. I watched him walk away, chest puffed with that familiar arrogance, completely unaware that he'd just humiliated himself in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Linda glanced back at me with something that looked like pity. But pity wasn't what I needed anymore. The shame he'd tried to pin on me was starting to transform into something else, something colder, clearer, more powerful. Years of being the invisible one, the helper, the one whose work never got recognized, had taught me exactly how power moves through organizations. And right now, standing in this lobby, where he'd tried to make me feel small, I realized that payback wasn't something I'd need to chase. It was something that was already in motion. The conference badge hanging around my neck felt heavier than it should, like it was carrying the weight of a secret Marcus couldn't imagine. His laughter still echoed in my ears, but underneath it, I could hear something else, the quiet hum of karma aligning itself. I'd spent years watching him be the golden child, the favored one, the one whose success was celebrated while mine was dismissed as just anything. But today, in this marble lobby where he'd chosen to shame me, the truth was about to catch up with both of us. What he'd done wasn't just cruel, it was reckless, because he'd opened a door he didn't know existed, and I was about to walk through it. The real story wasn't about what he'd said to me. It was about what he didn't know was coming, about the version of me he'd never bothered to meet, and about the moment when being underestimated would stop being my weakness and become my greatest advantage. Because the thing about invisible power is that nobody sees it until it's too late to do anything about it. Marcus thought he knew where I stood in the world, but he was about to learn that dignity isn't given by family. It's reclaimed by the person who refuses to stay small. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I could already see the moment when his smug expression would crack, when the room would go silent, and when he'd finally understand what he'd actually done today. Growing up, I was always the helper, while Marcus was the star, and that dynamic got carved into stone before I was old enough to fight it. Family dinners were performances where Dad would ask Marcus about his business ideas, and Mom would beam like he'd just cured cancer, while I'd be clearing plates and refilling water glasses. The betrayal wasn't loud or obvious. It was the quiet kind that builds over years, the kind where you're never directly told you don't matter, but you feel it in every room you walk into. I remember being 12, excited to show my parents a project I'd worked on for weeks, only to have Dad cut me off mid-sentence because Marcus needed help with his college applications. That's when I learned that my achievements were interruptions, that my voice was background noise in a house where only one child's future seemed to count. Just admin became Marcus's weapon of choice somewhere around my second year of college, right when I'd started working part-time in an office to pay my own tuition. He'd gotten a full ride and constant praise, while I was cobbling together scholarships and side jobs. But somehow my hustle became his punchline. At Thanksgiving, he'd introduce me to his friends as my sister who does office stuff. And Mom would laugh like it was charming instead of cruel. The humiliation wasn't in the words themselves. It was in the approval he got for saying them, the way our parents never once told him to stop diminishing me. I couldn't believe how casually they let him turn my work ethic into something shameful, how they stood by while he made admin sound like failure instead of the foundation I was building my entire future on. Every family gathering became a reminder that I existed to support, not to shine, and that pattern repeated itself so many times it started to feel like truth. When Marcus launched his first startup and it crashed within 6 months, Dad called it a learning experience and funded his second attempt. When I got promoted to a coordinator role, Mom asked if that meant I'd finally gotten a real job. The shocking part wasn't that they played favorites. Lots of families do. It was how systematic it was. How they'd constructed an entire narrative where his potential was infinite, and mine was capped at helpful. I started keeping my career moves to myself, not because I was ashamed, but because sharing them only gave Marcus more ammunition, and my parents more opportunities to compare me unfavorably to their golden child. The real education happened in those administrative roles Marcus loved to mock, because while he was learning business theory, I was learning how organizations actually function. I saw how decisions got made behind closed doors, how information flowed between departments, how one person's analysis could shift an entire strategy. My family thought I was filing papers and answering phones, but I was studying power. Who had it, how they used it, how the people nobody noticed were often the ones holding everything together. That invisible labor taught me more than any MBA could. And the best part was that Marcus's mockery gave me perfect cover to grow without interference. He was so busy telling everyone I was just admin that he never looked closely enough to see what I was actually becoming. Years passed, and the pattern stayed the same. Marcus would make a splash, get family support and funding, then pivot when things got hard, while I quietly climbed through roles that taught me operations, analysis, and eventually the language of acquisitions. Our parents never asked about my work because they'd already decided it wasn't impressive, and I'd stopped trying to convince them otherwise. The truth was, I didn't need their validation anymore. I'd found it in performance reviews, in projects that went well, in the moment my director told me I had a gift for seeing risks nobody else caught. Family betrayal has a way of pushing you either down or forward. And I'd chosen forward, even if it meant accepting that the people who raised me would never really see me. But that invisibility, that constant underestimation, was about to become the most powerful tool I'd ever had. Linda had always been peripheral to the family drama, pleasant but distant, buying whatever version of me Marcus sold without questioning it. She'd seen me at holidays being talked over, watched Marcus crack his admin jokes, probably assumed I was exactly what he said I was. But something was shifting now. Something I could feel building like pressure before a storm. The corporate summit wasn't just a conference. It was a collision point where Marcus's narrative and my reality were about to meet in the same space. And when they did, when the gap between who he said I was and who I actually had become finally revealed itself, everything our family had built on favoritism and dismissal would crack wide open in ways none of them were prepared for. The thing nobody tells you about being underestimated is that it gives you room to grow in directions people aren't watching. While Marcus was building his brand on social media and talking about his ventures at every family event, I was moving through roles that taught me how companies actually rise and fall. My administrative work wasn't the ceiling. It was the foundation, the place where I learned to read financial reports, spot operational weaknesses, and understand how due diligence could make or break a deal worth millions. I started in scheduling and coordination, sure, But I was studying every meeting I organized, every document I processed, every conversation I overheard between executives making decisions that would shape entire markets. The revenge wasn't something I planned. It was something I earned by refusing to stay in the box my family had built for me. 3 years into my career, I made a lateral move that confused everyone who knew me, shifting from operations support into a role that touched risk assessment and partnership evaluation. My parents didn't ask about it because they'd stopped asking about my work years ago, and Marcus certainly didn't care as long as he had new material for his jokes. But that move changed everything. It put me in rooms where companies were analyzed, where financial health was scrutinized, where my reports could influence whether a deal moved forward or died quietly. I learned the language of acquisitions, the metrics that mattered, the red flags that made investors pull back. And I was good at it. Good enough that my director started assigning me more complex evaluations. Good enough that legal and finance teams trusted my analysis when they were making recommendations worth 8 figures. The ascension was silent, because I'd learned that announcing your wins to people who don't celebrate them is just inviting more betrayal. I didn't post about promotions, didn't mention new responsibilities at family dinners, didn't correct Marcus when he introduced me as someone who does admin stuff. Let him think that. Let them all think that. Every time he mocked me, he was giving me cover to build something he couldn't see, and his arrogance became my camouflage. The shocking truth was that while he was scrambling to keep his startup afloat with investor meetings and pitch decks, I was becoming the person who evaluated companies like his for acquisition potential. The karma of it was almost poetic. He'd spent years making me feel worthless, and now I was literally assessing worth as part of my job. My self-worth stopped being tied to family approval the day I realized I was sitting in strategy meetings with VPs and directors who actually listened when I spoke. They didn't care that I'd started in administrative roles. They cared that I could read a balance sheet, identify sustainability issues, and predict which partnerships would create value versus which ones would drain resources. I remember the first time a senior executive defended my analysis against a consultant who tried to dismiss it, saying, "If she flagged it, we need to look closer. Her track record speaks for itself." That moment did more for my dignity than 1,000 family dinners ever could, because it proved that respect isn't inherited or gifted. It's earned through competence that people can't ignore. And I'd earned mine in a field where being wrong could cost companies millions, which meant being right made you invaluable. The corporate summit wasn't random. I was there because our firm was evaluating potential acquisition targets and partnership opportunities, and my role was to support the assessment process as part of a larger team. I'd helped build the framework we used to analyze companies, contributed to the scoring systems that determined which deals we'd pursue, and my analysis fed directly into reports that went to C-suite executives making final decisions. Marcus had no idea that when he'd mocked me in that lobby, he was standing in a space I'd helped create, surrounded by people who knew my work even if they didn't know my face. The cruelty of family favoritism had taught me to find validation elsewhere, and I'd found it in a career that gave me real power, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself because it shows up in outcomes. Keeping this growth secret from my family wasn't hard, because they'd never really been curious about my life beyond how it reflected on them. Marcus was too busy performing success to notice I'd stopped needing his approval, and our parents were too invested in their golden child narrative to question whether it was still accurate. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves when the stakes get high enough, and this summit was about to become the stage where my silence would finally speak louder than any announcement I could have made. Because the most powerful payback isn't telling people they were wrong about you. It's showing them in a moment so undeniable that their entire understanding of reality has to shift. And that moment was coming, whether Marcus knew it or not. The summit wasn't just any conference. It was one of those high-stakes gatherings where deals worth tens of millions get discussed over coffee, and entire futures get decided in closed-door sessions. I'd been part of the planning committee for months, coordinating with legal teams, finance analysts, and senior executives who were there to evaluate which companies aligned with our growth strategy. Marcus thought I was just attending, maybe helping with logistics or checking people in, because that's all his imagination allowed him to see when he looked at me. The truth was so much bigger and so much more dangerous for him, but he'd walked into that lobby with the same blind arrogance he'd carried his whole life. The betrayal he'd served me publicly was about to become the setup for the most shocking reversal either of us had ever experienced, And he had no idea he'd just stepped onto a battlefield where I wasn't a spectator. I was part of the team calling the shots. His company was on the list. I'd seen it weeks before the summit, sitting there among 24 other potential acquisition targets our firm was considering. The moment I recognized the name, something cold and clear settled in my chest. Not quite revenge, but definitely justice waiting to happen. Marcus had been pitching his startup as the next big thing, talking about scaling and disruption and all the buzzwords that sound impressive until someone actually examines the numbers. And examining numbers was exactly what my team did. We looked at revenue patterns, operational efficiency, leadership stability, market positioning, everything that separated real value from expensive hype. When I saw his company assigned to my evaluation queue, I knew I had to flag the potential conflict immediately. I went straight to my director and disclosed the family relationship. His response was simple. You'll present the data and analysis, but you won't vote on the final recommendation. Legal and finance will validate everything independently. We need your expertise on this framework. Just document everything meticulously. The inevitability of our paths crossing felt like karma designing its own climax, and I couldn't believe how perfectly the universe had arranged this confrontation. Every insult Marcus had thrown at me, every time he'd diminished my work, every family gathering where he'd made me feel small, all of it was leading to this moment where our professional worlds would collide in a space where his confidence couldn't protect him. The summit venue buzzed with energy, executives moving between sessions, assistants managing schedules, and underneath it all, the real work happening in private meetings where companies' fates got sealed. I knew which conference rooms mattered, which conversations would determine outcomes, and I knew that Marcus's company was scheduled for evaluation meetings that would include people from my team. The field was set, the players were in position, and he just announced his presence by humiliating me in front of the exact audience that would soon be judging his business. Linda had looked uncomfortable during his lobby performance, but not uncomfortable enough to stop him, which told me she either didn't understand the situation or didn't care enough to intervene. She'd been part of his world for 3 years, listening to his stories about his struggling sister, probably believing that he was the successful one and I was just getting by. Family betrayal extends through marriage sometimes, where spouses inherit the narrative without questioning it, and Linda had clearly bought the version Marcus sold. But the shocking part wasn't her complicity. It was how little it mattered now, because this wasn't about family perception anymore. This was about business reality, about numbers that don't lie, and evaluations that can't be charmed or manipulated by personality. Marcus had built his identity on being impressive, but impressive doesn't mean sustainable, and sustainability was exactly what we measured. The next 48 hours were going to reveal everything, and I could feel the weight of that knowledge pressing against my ribs every time I saw Marcus networking across the venue. He was in his element, shaking hands and making pitches, completely unaware that some of the people he was trying to impress were the same people who'd be in the room when his company's analysis got presented. The justice of it was almost overwhelming, not because I wanted him to fail, but because I needed him to finally see me clearly, to understand that the sister he'd mocked wasn't who he thought she was. Dignity doesn't come from proving people wrong out of spite. It comes from standing in your truth so firmly that their false version of you can't survive contact with reality. And reality was about to make contact in ways that would reshape everything Marcus thought he knew about power, family, and who actually held the cards in this game. I watched him from across the lobby, still riding high on the laughter he'd generated at my expense, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, but a kind of clarity that comes when you realize you're not the underdog anymore. The battlefield was set, the weapons were information and analysis, and the war wasn't going to be fought with insults or emotions. It was going to be fought with facts, with professional standards, with the kind of accountability that doesn't care about family history or golden child status. Marcus had chosen this moment to remind everyone that I was just admin, but what he'd actually done was mark the exact spot where his illusion would shatter. And the most powerful part was that I didn't have to do anything except my job. The truth would do the rest. The networking reception that evening was one of those carefully orchestrated events where champagne flows and conversations determine who gets a second meeting and who gets politely ghosted. Marcus was working the room like he owned it. Linda beside him with that practiced smile she'd perfected for these occasions. The summit brought together internal teams, external partners, and potential acquisition targets. A mix that meant not everyone knew everyone else's exact role, especially since many of us wore badges that listed company names rather than specific titles. I'd been talking with a group from legal when Linda broke away and approached me, her expression mixing curiosity with something that looked like guilt from the lobby incident. "So, Allison," she said loud enough that several nearby conversations paused, "what do you actually do here? Marcus always says you're an admin, but you seem pretty connected for someone who just schedules meetings." The question hung in the air, innocent on the surface but loaded with the kind of social pressure that demands a real answer, and I could feel Marcus's attention snap toward us from across the room. I could have deflated the moment, could have given some vague response that maintained his narrative and kept the peace, but something about the day, about years of being diminished, made me choose truth over comfort. The betrayal of that lobby humiliation was still fresh, and I was done protecting his ego at the expense of my reality. I met Linda's eyes and said one word, clean and clear: acquisitions. The effect was immediate and visceral. Linda's expression shifted from curious to confused, to something close to shock as the meaning registered. The executives standing near us went quiet, and I watched understanding dawn on faces that had been politely distant moments before. Because in the world of corporate summits and high-stakes deals, acquisitions isn't just a job title. It's a declaration of power, a signal that you're in rooms where companies live or die based on analysis and recommendations. Marcus had frozen mid-conversation, his champagne glass suspended halfway to his mouth, and I could see him trying to process what he'd just heard. "Acquisitions?" Linda repeated, like saying it again might change the meaning, and her voice had lost all its casual friendliness. One of the executives near us, a VP from our partner firm, smiled slightly and said, "Allison's being modest. She's part of the team that evaluates potential targets and partnership opportunities. Her risk assessments are some of the most thorough I've seen." The validation should have felt triumphant, but instead it just felt true, like a fact that had been waiting years to be acknowledged. I watched the color drain from Marcus's face as he understood what acquisitions meant in this context. What it meant that I was here not as support staff, but as someone who influenced decisions about companies exactly like his. The room had gone quiet in that specific way that happens when everyone realizes they're witnessing something significant, when social dynamics shift so dramatically that even strangers can feel it. Linda looked between me and Marcus, clearly trying to reconcile the person she'd just heard described with the just admin sister she'd been told about for 3 years. The shocking truth was spreading through the space like a revelation, and I could see Marcus's performance mask starting to crack. He'd built his entire family identity on being the successful one, the entrepreneur, the one with vision and ambition, while I was supposed to be the helper, the background character who made his story look better by comparison. But that story had just collapsed in front of witnesses who mattered, not because I'd attacked him, but because I'd finally told the truth about who I actually was. The duplicity of family favoritism is that it forces you to choose between honesty and belonging, and I'd spent years choosing belonging by staying small. But standing here with acquisitions hanging in the air like a confession I should have made years ago, I realized that reclaiming your dignity means accepting that some people will never celebrate you, and that's okay because their approval isn't what makes you valuable. Marcus was staring at me like he'd never seen me before, which was accurate. He hadn't, because he'd been too busy projecting his preferred version of me to notice the person I'd actually become. Linda's face had gone pale, and I could tell she was running through every family dinner, every casual dismissal, every joke Marcus had made at my expense, seeing them all through a different lens now. "Wait," Marcus finally managed, his voice tight. "You work in acquisitions? Since when?" The question was meant to sound skeptical, but came out desperate, like he was hoping I'd laugh and admit it was a misunderstanding. I didn't laugh. "About 3 years now," I said simply. "Started in operations analysis, moved into partnership evaluation. Now I'm part of the due diligence team for potential acquisitions." Each word was a nail in the coffin of his narrative, and I watched him struggle to maintain composure as the full implications settled over him. Because if I worked in acquisitions, and if his company was being considered for acquisition, then that meant his eyes widened as the pieces connected, and the karma of this moment was so perfectly orchestrated that it felt almost scripted. The sister he'd mocked for being just admin was now in a position to influence whether his company got the deal he'd been chasing for months. The evaluation meeting happened 2 days later in a glass-walled conference room that felt designed for transparency and judgment in equal measure. I sat at the table with our legal counsel, 2 finance analysts, a senior VP, and an external consultant who specialized in tech sector acquisitions. The kind of lineup that signals a company is either about to get very lucky or very exposed. Marcus's company was third on the agenda, and I'd spent the previous evening reviewing every document we had: financial statements, growth projections, customer retention data, operational structure, everything that would tell us whether this was a sustainable business or an expensive gamble. The betrayal of the lobby was still fresh, but as I laid out my analysis folders, I felt something colder than revenge. I felt professional responsibility, the kind that doesn't bend for family or feelings, because too much money and too many jobs depend on getting it right. When we reached Marcus's company, the VP nodded at me to begin, and I pulled up the presentation I'd prepared with the same standards I'd apply to any evaluation. Before I start, I want to reiterate that I've disclosed my family relationship to this company's founder, and I'm here to present data only, not to vote on the final recommendation, I said clearly. The VP nodded. Noted and documented. Your analysis carries weight because of your track record, not your vote. Legal and finance will independently validate everything. Proceed. I took a breath and began. Revenue growth looks impressive at first glance, but when you break it down by quarter, there's significant volatility that suggests customer acquisition without retention. Burn rate is concerning relative to runway, and the operational structure shows heavy concentration of decision-making without clear succession planning or distributed leadership. I wasn't editorializing. I was reporting what the numbers showed, what any competent analyst would flag as risks. But I could feel the weight of what this meant, how my professional assessment of Marcus's company would carry into recommendations that determined whether we moved forward. The shocking part wasn't that I found problems. It was that the problems were real, documented, and exactly the kind of red flags that made acquisitions dangerous. The finance analyst jumped in with questions about cash flow, and I walked through the data showing months where the company had come dangerously close to running out of operating capital. The consultant asked about market positioning, and I explained how their product had 3 direct competitors with better funding and clearer differentiation strategies. Legal wanted to know about contracts and partnerships, and I detailed the customer agreements that were short-term and unstable, the kind that could evaporate if a competitor offered a better price. Every answer I gave was backed by documentation, by numbers that couldn't be argued with, by the kind of thorough analysis that had earned me respect in these rooms. This wasn't vengeance disguised as work. This was work, pure and professional. And the fact that it was Marcus's company didn't change the standards we applied, or the truth we had to tell. The VP leaned back and asked the question that would determine everything. Bottom line, Allison. Based on your analysis, what are the primary risks here? The room went silent, and I felt the weight of my self-worth pressing against years of being diminished, of being told I was just admin, while I was building the expertise to answer exactly this kind of question. I looked at the data one more time, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I needed to be absolutely certain I was speaking from analysis and not emotion. Based on current performance, operational risks, and market positioning, I said clearly, the primary concerns are sustainability and infrastructure stability. The company shows growth potential, but lacks the proven resilience we typically need to justify this level of investment. Too many variables, not enough demonstrated staying power. The words came out clinical and precise, and nobody in that room could argue with them because they were true. What happened next was the VP turning to the group and saying, Allison's analysis has been reliable on every evaluation we've run this quarter. If she's flagging these issues, we take them seriously. Finance, legal, I want your independent validation on these points before we make any recommendation to the executive committee. The validation wasn't about me versus Marcus. It was about professional credibility that I'd earned through accuracy, through seeing what others missed, through being right when being wrong would have cost the firm millions. The consultant nodded. Legal made notes. And finance started discussing which additional data points they'd need to verify. Just like that, Marcus's deal was moving into intensive scrutiny. Not because I'd sabotaged him, but because his company couldn't withstand the kind of examination that every potential acquisition faces. The justice of it was clean and factual. He'd built something that looked good from the outside but couldn't hold up under analysis, and my job was to see through the performance to the reality underneath. As the meeting wrapped up, the VP asked if I'd prepare a detailed written analysis with supporting data for the validation team and executive committee review. I said yes, knowing that my report would be one of several factors that would determine Marcus's opportunity, and feeling the weight of that responsibility settle over me like armor. This was power. Not the loud, performative kind that Marcus had always chased, but the quiet, consequential kind that shapes outcomes without needing applause. The dignity I'd spent years searching for wasn't in proving him wrong publicly. It was in doing my job so well that the truth spoke for itself. And the truth was that while Marcus had been busy telling everyone I was nothing, I'd become someone whose analysis could reveal what companies were really worth, including his. The karma wasn't that I'd hurt him. It was that his own choices, his own business decisions, had created the vulnerability I was now professionally obligated to document. Marcus found me in the hotel lobby the next morning, his face tight with an emotion I'd never seen on him before. Something between panic and rage, with desperation bleeding through the edges. "We need to talk," he said, not asked. And the entitlement in his voice was the same one he'd used our entire lives when he needed me to fix something, or smooth something over, or make myself smaller so he could feel bigger. I'd been checking emails on my phone, reviewing notes before the day's sessions, and the interruption felt like a violation of the professional space I'd finally carved out for myself. But I followed him to a quiet corner anyway, because part of me wanted to hear what he'd say, now that the truth about my work had shattered his carefully constructed narrative. The betrayal of the lobby still stung, but this conversation felt different. It felt like the moment where everything we'd never said would finally get spoken out loud. I heard about the evaluation meeting. Marcus started, his voice low and urgent. "I need you to reconsider your recommendation. This deal is everything for my company. We've been working toward this for months, and one bad report from you could kill it." The audacity of it hit me like a slap. After years of mocking me, diminishing my work, and treating my career like a punchline, he was now asking me to compromise my professional integrity to save his business. I couldn't believe he thought that was even a possibility, that he'd so thoroughly missed who I'd become that he imagined I'd risk my reputation and credibility to protect him from the consequences of his own poor planning. The shocking part wasn't that he asked. It was that he seemed genuinely surprised when I didn't immediately agree, like family obligation should override everything I'd built. "Marcus," I said, keeping my voice steady even though anger was rising in my chest. I gave an honest assessment based on the data. Your burn rate is unsustainable, your customer retention is weak, and your operational structure has critical vulnerabilities. Those aren't opinions, they're facts that any analyst would flag. He shook his head like I was being deliberately difficult, like I was inventing problems to hurt him instead of doing the job I'd been trained to do. "You could position it differently," he pressed. "Emphasize the growth potential, downplay the risks. Just give us a fighting chance. I'm your brother. Doesn't that count for something?" And there it was. The assumption that family meant I owed him protection from reality, that being related gave him the right to ask me to lie in a professional context where my word was the only currency I had. The treachery of his request, asking me to betray my own standards, my own reputation, to save him from problems he'd created, made something inside me snap into perfect clarity. "What counts," I said, and my voice came out harder than I'd intended, "is that I spent years being just admin in your eyes while I was actually building expertise that matters. What counts is that you humiliated me in front of colleagues 3 days ago because you couldn't imagine I'd earned respect in my field. And what counts now is that I'm not going to compromise my professional integrity because you want special treatment." I watched his face cycle through emotions. Shock that I was refusing, anger that I wasn't bending, and something that looked almost like fear as he realized I meant every word. The revenge he was experiencing wasn't something I'd inflicted. It was the natural consequence of underestimating someone for so long that you forget they're capable of saying no. Marcus tried a different angle, his voice taking on that manipulative tone I recognized from childhood arguments. "So this is payback? You're going to tank my deal because I made a joke in the lobby?" He was trying to reframe my professional assessment as personal vendetta, trying to make me the villain in a story where he was just an innocent victim of his sister's hurt feelings. But I'd spent enough years in corporate environments to recognize deflection when I heard it, and I wasn't going to let him twist accountability into revenge. "This isn't payback," I said firmly. "This is me doing my job with the same standards I'd apply to any company, including yours. If you'd built something sustainable, my report would reflect that. You didn't, and it doesn't. That's not personal. That's business reality." The dignity I felt in that moment wasn't about winning or losing. It was about refusing to sacrifice my self-worth on the altar of his ego one more time. He stared at me like he was seeing a stranger. And maybe he was. Maybe the sister who'd always fixed things and smoothed things over and made herself convenient was finally, fully gone. "Mom and Dad are going to hear about this," he said. And the threat was so childish, so quintessentially Marcus, that I almost laughed. "Tell them whatever you want," I replied. "I'm done letting family drama compromise my professional life. You want a better outcome? Build a better company. But don't ask me to lie in a room full of people who trust my analysis because you can't handle the truth about what you've created." I turned to walk away, and the justice of leaving him standing there, speechless, powerless, finally understanding that I wasn't his to control, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd given away years ago without realizing it. The confrontation wasn't the climax. It was the declaration that I'd chosen my own integrity over his comfort, and that choice was irreversible. I spent the next 2 days finalizing my written analysis, and every word felt like drawing a line in permanent ink between who I used to be and who I'd become. The report was 12 pages of data, charts, comparative benchmarks, and risk assessment, clinical, thorough, and completely defensible. I documented every concern with supporting evidence, showed where Marcus's company fell short against industry standards, and made it clear that acquisition would represent significant financial exposure with limited upside potential. There was no emotion in the language, no hint of family drama or personal history, just the kind of professional analysis that executives rely on when they're deciding whether to invest millions. The betrayal Marcus had served me in that lobby had nothing to do with my conclusions. The numbers told the story all by themselves, and my job was simply to read them correctly and report what they said. Before I submitted the report, I reviewed it 3 times, not because I doubted my analysis, but because I needed to be absolutely certain I could defend every statement, every flag, every assessment if challenged. My director reviewed it too, and his only comment was, "Thorough work as always," with no questions about my objectivity or methodology. That validation mattered more than any family approval ever could. It meant my professional reputation was solid enough that nobody doubted my ability to separate personal relationships from business judgment. The shocking truth was that Marcus's company really did have all the problems I'd identified, and if I'd softened my assessment to protect him, I'd have been lying to my firm and potentially exposing them to a failed investment. The dignity I felt in sending that report came from knowing I'd chosen accuracy over comfort, even when the cost was a family relationship that had already been broken for years. I hit send on the email at 4:47 p.m. on a Thursday, and the weight that lifted off my shoulders wasn't relief exactly. It was the sensation of having done something irreversible and necessary, like cutting away dead tissue so healthy tissue could grow. The report went to the validation team, executive committee, legal, finance, and the senior partners who'd make the final decision about which companies to pursue. I knew the process would take weeks. Meetings, deliberations, independent verification, maybe some follow-up questions. But the direction was set. My analysis would be one voice among several, but it carried weight because I'd earned credibility through consistent accuracy. Unless something dramatically changed with Marcus's company, or the validation team found errors in my work, the outcome was already determined. The justice of it was impersonal and bureaucratic, which somehow made it more powerful than any dramatic confrontation could have been. This wasn't revenge. It was consequence. delivered through professional channels that didn't care about family history. 3 weeks later, I was in a different city working on a different evaluation when the email arrived in my inbox with the subject line, Acquisition Pipeline, Final Decisions, Q4. I opened it during a coffee break, scrolling through the list of companies that had been approved for next stage discussions and the ones that had been officially passed over. Marcus's company was in the second category, with a brief note. Due diligence revealed operational and financial risks incompatible with acquisition strategy. Independent validation confirmed initial assessment. No further action recommended. The words were bureaucratic and final, and I read them twice to let the reality sink in. His opportunity was gone. Not because I'd sabotaged him, but because his business couldn't withstand professional scrutiny from multiple independent reviewers. The karma of it was almost elegant. He'd spent years diminishing my work, and now that work had revealed the truth about his. I didn't feel triumphant reading that email. I felt tired and clear, and strangely at peace with the role I'd played in an outcome that had been determined by facts rather than feelings. The cruelty of family favoritism had taught me that approval from people who don't truly see you is worthless, and I'd stopped chasing it long ago. What I felt instead was the solid ground of self-worth that comes from doing your job well even when it's hard, even when it costs you relationships, even when the easy path would be to compromise and smooth things over, like you've always done before. Marcus had built something that looked impressive from the outside, but couldn't hold up under examination, and I'd simply told the truth about what I saw. The decision that followed wasn't mine alone. It was the collective judgment of experienced professionals who agreed that the risks outweighed the potential. But I'd been the one to document those risks clearly enough that they couldn't be ignored. That evening, I sat in my hotel room, knowing that somewhere Marcus was receiving the same email, reading the same words, and understanding that the deal he'd been counting on was dead. Part of me wondered if he'd connect the dots back to my report, if he'd realize that the sister he'd called just admin had been the analyst whose assessment carried enough weight to influence the decision. Part of me wondered if he'd ever understand that this wasn't about revenge. It was about me finally choosing my own integrity over his convenience, my professional reputation over his family narrative, my truth over his comfortable lies. The shocking revelation wasn't that I had this power. It was that I'd earned it through years of work he'd never bothered to acknowledge. And now that power had consequences he couldn't charm or manipulate his way out of. The email was sent, the decision was made, and there was no going back for either of us. My mother's call came exactly 4 days after the official email, and I knew before I answered what the conversation would be. Marcus had run to our parents like he always did when reality didn't bend to his will, and now they were calling to fix it for him. "Allison, we need to talk about what you did to your brother," Mom said, before I could even say hello, her voice sharp with accusation and heavy with that particular brand of disappointment she'd perfected over the years. No greeting, no asking how I was, just straight into the betrayal narrative where I was the villain who'd destroyed Marcus's dreams out of spite. I couldn't believe we were back to this pattern, me being blamed for consequences that Marcus had created himself, expected to apologize for refusing to sacrifice my integrity to protect him from his own poor decisions. The deception of it was familiar and exhausting. Once again, I was the problem for not making myself smaller to accommodate his failure. "I didn't do anything to Marcus," I said, keeping my voice level, even though anger was building in my chest. "I did my job. I evaluated his company with the same professional standards I'd apply to any business, and I reported what the data showed. But Mom wasn't interested in professional standards or data. She was interested in family loyalty, as she defined it, which apparently meant lying to protect your brother's business from honest assessment. "You could have helped him," she insisted. "You could have given him a chance instead of sabotaging his opportunity. He's your brother, Allison. Family is supposed to support each other, not tear each other down." The shocking part wasn't that she was defending him. It was that she genuinely couldn't see the difference between support and enabling, between helping and compromising your own professional reputation to cover for someone else's inadequacy. Dad got on the line, and his voice had that stern quality he'd used when I was a kid, and needed to be brought back in line. "Your mother's right. This situation needs to be fixed. Marcus worked hard on that deal, and one bad report from you shouldn't be the reason it falls apart. You need to go back to your company and tell them you made a mistake, that you missed something in your analysis." The request was so absurd, so disconnected from how professional evaluations actually work, that I almost laughed. They wanted me to tell my firm I'd been incompetent, to undermine my own credibility and reputation, to essentially commit career suicide so Marcus could get a deal his company didn't deserve. The revenge they were demanding wasn't justice. It was asking me to destroy what I'd built so their golden child could continue failing upward with family protection. "I'm not doing that," I said firmly. "I'm not going to lie to my company, and I'm not going to pretend Marcus's business is something it isn't. He has real operational problems, unsustainable burn rate, weak customer retention. These aren't things I invented to hurt him. They're facts that were independently validated by multiple professionals." Mom made a sound of frustration, and I could hear her conferring with Dad in the background, probably strategizing about which guilt button to push next. "Do you realize what you've done?" She came back, her voice rising. "You've destroyed your brother's future, humiliated him in front of his investors, and damaged his reputation. Is that what you wanted? To get payback for some imaginary slight?" The way she dismissed years of being diminished as imaginary slight told me everything I needed to know about how my family saw me. My pain wasn't real, my boundaries weren't valid, and my professional achievements only mattered when they could be weaponized to serve Marcus's interests. "What I wanted," I said, and I could feel years of suppressed truth pushing up through my throat, was a family that respected me enough not to mock me in public. What I wanted was parents who saw my work as valuable instead of treating it like a joke. What I wanted was a brother who didn't spend a decade calling me just admin like it was an insult, when I was actually building a career that matters. The silence on the other end was sharp and uncomfortable, and I knew they were shocked that I was pushing back instead of apologizing like I always had before. "But what I've learned," I continued, "is that family should lift you up, not tear you down to make someone else look better. And I'm not going to sacrifice my career, my reputation, or my self-worth to save Marcus from consequences he created himself. If you want to help him build a better company. But don't ask me to lie for him. I won't do it." Mom's voice went cold in that way it did when I'd crossed a line she didn't know existed. "Then you're choosing your job over your family," she said, like it was a moral failing instead of a reasonable boundary. "We raised you better than this, Allison. We taught you that family comes first." The manipulation was obvious. Fall in line or be cast out. Sacrifice yourself or be labeled selfish. Enable Marcus or be the one who destroyed family unity. But I'd spent enough time in professional environments to recognize emotional blackmail when it was happening. And I'd learned that people who demand you set yourself on fire to keep them warm aren't actually concerned about your well-being. "Families should respect each other," I replied quietly. "Family shouldn't ask you to compromise your integrity. And if choosing honesty over favoritism means I'm not the daughter you wanted, then I guess that's something we both have to live with." I hung up before either of them could respond, and the dignity of that moment, of finally choosing myself over their approval, felt like breathing clean air after years of suffocation. Linda's message came through 2 days after the phone call with my parents, a simple text that said, "Can we talk? Coffee tomorrow?" And my first instinct was to decline because I assumed she was there to defend Marcus or deliver some new version of family guilt. But something about the tone felt different. Less demanding, more tentative. So I agreed to meet her at a cafe downtown, neutral territory where neither of us had home advantage. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 coffees ordered, and the body language was all wrong for an ambush. Shoulders slightly hunched, hands wrapped around her cup like she needed the warmth. Eyes that met mine with something that looked more like apology than accusation. The betrayal I'd experienced from Marcus and my parents had made me cautious about family connections, but Linda had always been peripheral to the drama, and I was curious about what had shifted enough for her to reach out. "Thank you for coming," she started, and her voice had none of the defensive edge I'd expected. "I've been thinking about everything that happened at the summit, about what Marcus did in that lobby, about what I've learned since then." She took a breath like she was gathering courage, and I stayed quiet, letting her find her words. I owe you an apology, Allison. I've been with Marcus for 3 years, and in all that time I just accepted his version of who you were. He made you sound like someone who needed help, who wasn't quite successful, who he was being generous to by staying connected with. And I never questioned it. I just bought the narrative he was selling without ever really getting to know you myself. The shocking honesty of her admission caught me off guard, because family members admitting they were wrong wasn't something I'd experienced much of in my life. Linda continued, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. After that night when you said acquisitions, and I saw everyone's reaction, I started asking questions. I looked you up professionally, talked to some people who knew your work. And Allison, what Marcus told me and what's actually true are completely different stories. Oh, she shook her head, looking genuinely disturbed. You're not struggling or barely getting by. You're actually really successful in a field that influences major business decisions. And he knew that, or should have known that, but he kept telling this story about you being just admin because it made him feel bigger. The validation from someone who'd been inside Marcus's world, who'd seen the family dynamics from his perspective and was now calling them out, meant more than I'd expected. It wasn't revenge to hear someone else acknowledge the truth. It was justice. The kind that comes when lies get exposed by people who have no reason to lie. I've been watching him these past few weeks since the deal fell through, Linda said, her voice dropping lower. And I'm seeing patterns I didn't want to see before. The way he blames everyone else when things go wrong. The way he rewrites history to make himself the victim. The way he genuinely believes he deserves success without having to build something sustainable to earn it. She looked at me directly, and I saw something in her expression that looked like solidarity. What you did with that evaluation, Marcus is calling it revenge, and your parents are calling it betrayal. But from where I'm sitting, it looks like you just told the truth. His company does have the problems you identified. I've seen the financial reports, the customer complaints, the operational chaos. You didn't make those up to hurt him. They're real. The karma of having Marcus's own wife validate my assessment was almost overwhelming because it proved that the issue wasn't my perception. It was his reality. I want you to know that what happened wasn't your fault. Linda continued. Marcus has always had this way of making people believe his version of events, of distorting how others see him and everyone around him. Your parents, his investors, even me. We all bought it because he's charismatic and confident and really good at selling a story. But you didn't destroy his opportunity, Allison. You just stopped protecting him from the consequences of his own choices. And that's not the same thing. She paused, and I could see her working through something difficult. I'm not sure what's going to happen with us, with Marcus and me, because I'm seeing him differently now, and I don't know if I can unsee it. But I needed you to know that not everyone in the family believes their narrative. What you did took courage, and it was the right thing professionally, and you shouldn't have to carry guilt for refusing to compromise your integrity. The unexpected alliance shifted something in my chest, loosening a knot I didn't know was there. Linda wasn't family by blood, but she'd been inside the system that had diminished me, and her choosing to step out and validate my truth felt like a kind of vindication I hadn't known I needed. Thank you, I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended. I've spent so long being told I'm the problem, being made to feel like my perception of things was wrong, that hearing someone else see it clearly means more than you probably realize. She nodded, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand briefly. You set a boundary, she said firmly. You chose your own dignity over family dysfunction. That's not revenge. That's self-respect. And if Marcus and your parents can't see the difference, that says everything about them and nothing about you. We sat there for another hour, talking about family dynamics and professional integrity and what it costs to finally choose yourself. And when I left that cafe, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. The possibility that truth could create connection instead of destroying it, that honesty could build bridges with people brave enough to cross them. 6 months after the summit, I moved to a different city for a position that felt less like a job change and more like a declaration of independence, a senior role with a firm that valued my analysis enough to recruit me specifically, where nobody knew Marcus or my parents or the family narrative that had defined me for so long. The physical distance mirrored the emotional separation I'd been building since that phone call with my parents. Since the moment I'd chosen professional integrity over family approval and discovered I could survive the fallout. I'd stopped answering my mother's calls after the third one, where she tried to guilt me into fixing things with Marcus. And I'd blocked my father's number when he sent a text calling me selfish for putting career over blood. The betrayal of realizing your family would rather you diminish yourself than accept who you've become is brutal, but it's also clarifying. It shows you that some relationships are built on you staying small, and walking away from those relationships isn't loss, it's liberation. Marcus tried to reach out once through LinkedIn, with a message that managed to be both apologetic and accusatory, saying he was sorry things got so complicated, but also hoping I understood the damage my report had caused to his reputation and opportunities. I read it twice, looking for actual accountability or genuine reflection, and found neither, just more of the same pattern where his feelings mattered and mine didn't, where his struggles deserved sympathy and mine were inconvenient. I didn't respond, because engaging would have meant reopening a door I'd deliberately closed, and I'd learned that some people will never see you clearly, because acknowledging your reality would force them to question their own. The shocking truth was that letting go of family who couldn't celebrate me felt less like revenge and more like self-preservation, like finally understanding that you can't build dignity on a foundation of people who need you to fail so they can feel successful. The work in my new role was challenging and rewarding, in ways that had nothing to do with proving myself to anyone. I was evaluating companies, identifying risks and opportunities, contributing to decisions that shaped industries, and nobody in these rooms knew or cared about my family history. They knew my analysis, my track record, my ability to see what others missed, and that professional identity felt more real than any family label ever had. I started speaking at industry conferences, publishing articles about risk assessment methodologies, building a reputation that belonged entirely to me rather than existing in contrast to someone else's narrative. The justice of it wasn't about Marcus knowing I'd succeeded. It was about me knowing it, feeling it in every project that went well, and every colleague who respected my input, understanding that self-worth doesn't require an audience of people who diminished you. It just requires you to stop performing for them. I thought about the summit sometimes, about that moment in the lobby when Marcus had called me just admin, loud enough for half the room to hear, and I realized that humiliation had been a gift disguised as an attack. It had forced the confrontation I'd been avoiding for years, pushed me to finally speak the truth about who I was, instead of letting his version of me be the only story that got told. If he hadn't mocked me that day, I might have stayed quiet, might have let the evaluation process happen without ever revealing my role in it, might have maintained the uncomfortable peace that comes from never challenging family narratives. But his cruelty had created the conditions for my truth to emerge. And that truth had reshaped everything. Not just between us, but inside me. In the way I understood my own value and refused to negotiate it down for anyone's comfort. Linda and I stayed in touch. Occasional texts and calls where she updated me on her own journey toward seeing her relationship with Marcus clearly, and eventually choosing to end it. She'd started therapy, she told me, to understand why she'd been so willing to accept his narrative about me and about himself, why she'd ignored red flags in his character, because his confidence made them easy to dismiss. "You were right to walk away," she said during one call. "Not everyone can be saved from themselves, and trying just means you drown with them." Her validation mattered because it came from someone who'd had nothing to gain by seeing the truth, who'd actually lost a relationship by acknowledging it, and who'd chosen honesty over convenience just like I had. The karma of Marcus losing both the deal and his marriage wasn't something I'd orchestrated. It was the natural consequence of building a life on performance instead of substance, on image instead of integrity. I built a life in my new city that felt like speaking in my own voice for the first time. Friendships with people who knew me as Allison the analyst, not Allison the disappointing sister. Professional relationships built on mutual respect instead of family obligation. A sense of self that didn't require constant defense against someone else's diminishment. And when I thought about that question I'd asked myself in the lobby after Marcus's mockery, about who actually held power in that room, I realized the answer had been more complex than I'd understood at the time. He'd held social power in that moment. The ability to make people laugh at my expense. But I'd held structural power. The kind that shapes outcomes and determines futures, and doesn't need to announce itself to be real. The dignity I'd reclaimed wasn't about proving I had that power. It was about finally being willing to use it honestly, even when honesty cost me a family that had never really seen me anyway. And standing in my truth, in this life I'd built by refusing to stay small, felt like the most profound revenge possible, not against Marcus, but against every voice, internal and external, that had ever told me just admin was all I'd ever be. So let me ask you something, because I need to know if I'm the only one who's lived through this kind of family drama, or if this story hits closer to home than you want to admit. Have you ever had family members who thought they could rewrite reality to suit their narrative, who believed their version of events mattered more than the actual truth? Have you been the one dismissed, diminished, or underestimated while someone else got all the credit and support? I want to hear your story in the comments below. Tell me about the moment you realized your family's betrayal had crossed a line, about how you handled it, about whether you chose revenge, justice, or just walked away. Did you ever have to choose between your own integrity and family approval? And here's the harder question. When you finally stood up for yourself, when you chose dignity over keeping the peace, did they call you selfish? Did they try to make you feel guilty for refusing to play along with their dysfunction anymore? Because that's what they do. People who thrive on controlling the narrative will always paint your boundaries as betrayal, your self-respect as cruelty, your refusal to stay small as somehow being the villain in their story. I need to know how you responded when family demanded you sacrifice your integrity to protect their lies. Did you bend, or did you break free? Share your experience below. Not just for me, but for everyone else reading this who needs to know they're not alone in navigating the impossible choice between family loyalty and personal truth. Comment below with your story, your reflections, your moments of shocking revelation, when you realize that blood doesn't always mean loyalty, and family doesn't always mean safe. Let's build a community here, where we can talk honestly about betrayal, justice, karma, and what it actually costs to reclaim your dignity from people who never valued it in the first place. Your voice matters, your experience matters, and someone reading this needs to hear that they're not crazy for feeling hurt by family dysfunction disguised as love. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own family dynamics, or gave you language for something you've been struggling to explain, do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because I'm going to keep sharing insights like this. Provocative, real, unfiltered stories about family betrayal, revenge, justice, and the messy process of choosing yourself when everyone else expects you to stay small. These aren't comfortable conversations, but they're necessary ones. And I promise to keep bringing you content that challenges the narrative that family is always right, and that forgiveness always means reconciliation. Sometimes justice looks like walking away. Sometimes revenge is just letting the truth speak for itself. And sometimes the most radical thing you can do is tell your story in your own voice, instead of letting others define who you are. So subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's keep having these conversations that nobody else wants to have, but everybody desperately needs.